Michael Dawson slammed both hands on the conference table, so hard the water glasses rattled. "Say it again," he said. "Say it to my face this time." The man across from him, Gerald Voss, 44 years old, 200 flight hours more than Michael, 3 times the commercial experience, didn't flinch. He just leaned back in his chair and said it with the particular laziness of someone who believed he was protected by the truth of what he was saying. "She doesn't belong in that seat, not on a transatlantic run. Not on anything that matters. A woman who can't even stand up doesn't get to decide whether $40 million walks out the door or not. I'm not flying for that." The room went completely still. 9 pilots had already walked out that door, and every single one of them had a cleaner reason than the one Gerald Voss just said out loud. Michael straightened up slowly. He picked up the contract folder from the table. He looked at Daniel Brooks standing against the wall, pale and silent, and then he looked back at the man who had just said the quiet part at full volume. "Then get out," Michael said. "I'll take the job." Nobody in that room knew those 4 words were about to change 2 broken lives forever. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far the story travels. And if you believe one good man can change everything, hit that subscribe button. Because this one is going to stay with you. The 10th resignation letter arrived before sunrise. Daniel Brooks held it in both hands the way you hold something you already know is bad news, carefully, like it might cut you if you squeeze too hard. He'd been the head of aviation recruitment at Apex Horizon Technologies for 11 years. He'd hired cargo pilots, charter pilots, military veterans, airline men with 20,000 hours behind them. He thought he'd seen every kind of difficult. He had not seen this. 9 pilots, 9 contracts offered, 9 men who took the folder home, read through the requirements, sometimes got as far as a second interview, and then disappeared. Some sent polite emails. 2 had their lawyers call. 1 simply stopped answering his phone. And this last one, a 44-year-old former commercial captain named Gerald Voss, with a chest full of certifications and references that read like a hall of fame, had printed his resignation on company letterhead at 6 in the morning and left it on Daniel's desk like a formal declaration of war. Daniel set the letter down and looked at the clock on the wall above his desk. 7:15. The next interview was scheduled for 8. He pulled the folder toward him and opened it. 1 name. 1 resume. 1 last candidate that his assistant had flagged from a pile of late submissions with a sticky note that read, "This one's different. Maybe worth a look. Michael Dawson, 39 years old. Former United States Air Force. 4 combat deployments. 12 years of military aviation, rated for multiple fixed-wing aircraft and 2 rotary platforms. Decorations that required a second page to list. Medical clearance, current. Flight hours, 8,400 logged, roughly 600 of them in conditions that most civilian pilots would have refused as too dangerous. Single father, 1 daughter, age 7. Currently employed as a cargo pilot for a regional air freight company, working a schedule that paid just enough to keep the lights on." Daniel closed the folder and stared at the wall. He had stopped believing any single resume could surprise him. But there was something about the way this one read, not the certifications, not the hours, something in the way it was written. No inflated language, no performance, just a man laying out exactly who he was with the kind of directness that you only find in people who've stopped pretending to be anything other than what they are. He was still thinking about it when the door to the lobby opened and Michael Dawson walked in. Michael had driven 3 hours that morning. He'd left before dawn, before Lily woke up, because he didn't want her to see him nervous. He'd made her lunch the night before and left it in the refrigerator with a note drawn in marker, a small airplane with a smiley face, and the words "back by dinner." Baby girl, and then he'd sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, going over everything he knew about Apex Horizon Technologies and the woman who ran it. He'd read every article, every profile, every interview. Clara Whitmore, 35 years old, CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the United States. Built the business from a startup, run out of a rented office into a global enterprise with operations on 4 continents. Annual revenue that analysts described in numbers Michael had to read twice to believe. And then there was the rest of the story. The part that wasn't in the press releases. 5 years ago, Clara Whitmore had been a passenger on a private charter flight to a venture capital conference in San Francisco. Somewhere over the Rockies, the aircraft encountered a catastrophic mechanical failure. The pilot and co-pilot managed to bring the plane down in one piece, barely, in a field outside a small Colorado town. 3 people walked away without serious injury. Clara was not one of them. The spinal damage was severe, complete. The doctors were careful in their language, but the meaning was plain. She would use a wheelchair for the rest of her life. She was back at work inside of 4 months. Michael had read that part 3 times. He'd tried to imagine what that took. What it required of a person to come back from something like that and not disappear. To not let the fear win, he couldn't fully imagine it. But he understood the shape of it, that particular stubborn refusal to be buried by something that was trying to bury you. He knew that shape from the inside. He'd been living inside it for 18 months. He pulled his truck into the visitor parking lot at Apex Horizon headquarters, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. The building was everything the company's reputation suggested it would be. Glass and steel, and deliberate architecture, the kind of building designed to make you feel the weight of the people inside it. He was wearing his best jacket and his only tie, which Lily had helped him pick out 2 nights before, holding them both up with the concentrated seriousness of a 7-year-old performing an important duty. "This one, Daddy. The blue one makes you look like a captain." He straightened the tie in the rearview mirror. Then, he got out of the truck and walked in. Daniel Brooks met him in the lobby. He was shorter than Michael expected, compact and efficient-looking, with the manner of a man who had been delivering difficult news for long enough that it no longer required any special preparation. "Mr. Dawson," he extended his hand. "Thank you for making the drive." "Appreciate the opportunity," Michael said. They walked to a conference room on the 2nd floor. Small, 1 window, a table with a folder on it and 2 chairs across from each other. Daniel closed the door and sat down. Michael sat across from him and set his hands flat on the table, a habit from years of briefings, a way of keeping himself still when everything inside him was moving. "I want to be direct with you," Daniel said, "please. You're the 10th candidate we've interviewed for this position. The previous 9 all had comparable qualifications. Some had significantly more commercial experience. None of them accepted the job." Michael didn't say anything. "I'm going to tell you exactly what they were told, and then I'm going to tell you something they weren't told, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a sales pitch." Daniel opened the folder. "The job is personal pilot for Clara Whitmore, CEO. You would be responsible for all executive air travel. Domestic and international. The schedule is demanding. There are periods, particularly around major contract negotiations or product launches, when you may be required to be on standby for days at a stretch with very limited personal time. The compensation is substantial, but the demands are real." "What's the something they weren't told?" Michael asked. Daniel looked at him for a moment. "The previous pilots didn't leave because the schedule was too hard," he said. 2 of them left because they thought a woman in a wheelchair shouldn't be running a company that size. 3 of them left because she pushed back on decisions they made, and they couldn't handle taking direction from someone they'd already decided couldn't possibly know more than them. The rest left for reasons they didn't explain, but I've been doing this long enough to make an educated guess. Which is, they couldn't separate the job from the judgment." Daniel folded his hands. "This job requires you to work in very close proximity to a woman who is exceptionally intelligent, exceptionally direct, and uses a wheelchair. Some men find those 3 things together to be more than they bargained for." Michael was quiet for a moment. "What does the job actually require?" he said. "The flying part." Daniel almost smiled. "Safe, reliable, professional air transport. Discretion. The ability to manage irregular schedules without complaint. The judgment to handle in-flight decisions with confidence and without requiring external validation for every call. And the non-flying part? Treating your employer like a human being." Michael looked at him steadily. 9 pilots couldn't do that? "Apparently not." "All right," Michael said. "When do I meet her?" Clara Whitmore did not keep people waiting. That was one of the first things Michael noticed when Daniel led him to the executive suite on the 14th floor. The assistant outside the door made one phone call, said 3 words, and then nodded and stepped aside. No holding room, no 15 minutes of quiet power theater. The door opened and they walked in. She was behind her desk. The desk was large and clean, the kind of surface that suggested serious work without the performance of chaos. The window behind her showed the city in mid-morning light. She was reviewing something on a tablet. And she finished the sentence she was reading before she looked up. That was the second thing he noticed. She finished the sentence. She didn't perform urgency, and she didn't perform indifference. She just finished what she was doing, set the tablet down, and looked at him with the clear, level attention of someone who had spent years learning to assess people quickly. The wheelchair was there. He saw it. He registered it the same way he registered the desk and the window and the city behind her as part of the room, part of the context, not a separate thing requiring separate acknowledgement. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "Miss Whitmore, sit down." He sat. Daniel stepped back toward the wall, quiet, the way good support staff know how to disappear into a room. Clara laced her fingers together and looked at Michael across the desk. She had the kind of face that was not conventionally beautiful, and was much more interesting for it, strong, precise, with dark eyes that processed information visibly, like you could watch her thinking if you looked carefully enough. "Daniel tells me you served in the Air Force," she said. 12 years, 3 platforms, finished as a major. Where were you deployed? Afghanistan twice, Iraq once. And a support rotation in the Horn of Africa that technically didn't happen. He paused. Officially, something moved in her face. Not quite a smile. "You flew in combat conditions?" "I flew in conditions where people were actively trying to make sure I didn't land," he said. "Yes, and since leaving the service?" "Cargo, regional freight." "Nothing glamorous. Why the downgrade?" she asked. The word was pointed but not unkind. It was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "My wife passed 18 months ago," Michael said. "Commercial airline schedules would have kept me away from my daughter for weeks at a time. I wasn't willing to do that." Clara didn't offer condolences. She just absorbed the information and held it. He appreciated that more than she could have known. Condolences from strangers had started to feel like a formality he had to manage, a social exchange that required him to comfort the person offering comfort. Her silence let him just say the thing and move on. "You understand what this job requires," she said. It wasn't a question. Long hours, irregular schedule. Close quarters with a demanding principal. High-stakes travel, sometimes on short notice. The need to make serious decisions quickly and own them. He looked at her. "And apparently the ability to treat my employer like a person." Her expression shifted, subtle. "Daniel told you that?" "He was honest with me. I appreciated it. Most people find honesty uncomfortable when it's that direct." "Most people haven't flown in a combat zone," he said. "You get comfortable with things being exactly what they are." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at him with those precise dark eyes, and he had the feeling of being measured accurately, which was different from being measured favorably. Favorable measurements could be wrong. Accurate ones had a specific weight to them. 9 pilots said no, she said finally, I heard. "Does that concern you?" "It tells me the job is hard," Michael said. "Hard jobs are usually the ones worth doing. What if I told you that every one of those 9 men was more qualified than you on paper?" "I'd say paper doesn't fly the plane." Silence. Then Clara Whitmore picked up the tablet, set it to the side, and said, "I want to talk to you about the technical requirements of the role. The aircraft type, the routes, the procedures." "Good," Michael said. "That's what I came here for." They talked for 2 hours. Not about the wheelchair, not about the accident, not about the 9 pilots who had refused, or the complex politics of what it meant to work for a woman who other men had decided to condescend to. They talked about flying, and Michael discovered something inside those 2 hours that he had not expected to find. Clara Whitmore knew aircraft. Not in the generalized way of someone who had spent years as a frequent passenger and absorbed information by proximity. She knew them structurally. She understood aerodynamics and systems, and the particular vulnerability of different aircraft types to different weather conditions. She asked him questions that required real answers, not reassurances. When he described a difficult instrument approach he'd managed in poor visibility during a cargo run over Wyoming the previous winter, she asked 3 precise follow-up questions about his decision tree, about the point at which he would have gone missed approach, about how he'd communicated the situation to his company dispatcher. They were the questions an experienced pilot would ask, or an experienced engineer, or someone who had spent a long time understanding exactly what could go wrong in the air and why. Near the end of the second hour, she said, "Why do you want this job, mister?" Dawson, honestly, he looked at her for a moment. "Because I need the income," he said. "My daughter has medical bills from last year that I'm still working through, and cargo flying doesn't pay what this does." That's the honest answer, and I'm not going to dress it up. Most candidates lead with their passion for aviation. My passion for aviation doesn't keep the lights on. And if I told you the compensation concern was already noted, and asked you what else draws you to the position? Michael was quiet for a moment. He thought about the article he'd read at 2 in the morning, the one that described Clara's return to work 4 months after the accident. The piece had quoted a board member who said she'd come back with something to prove. Clara herself had been quoted once briefly with a different framing. She'd said she came back because she wasn't finished. "You came back to a job that everyone expected you to walk away from," he said. "And you couldn't walk at all." He said it without flinching, without apology, without softening. "I respect that. I understand that kind of stubbornness. The kind that isn't about proving anything to anyone else. The kind that's just about not letting something that happened to you become the whole story of who you are." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "My daughter's name is Lily," he said. "She's 7. She lost her mother. Every morning she gets up and goes to school and does her homework and laughs at things and learns new words and tries new foods. And she does all of that carrying something that no 7-year-old should have to carry. I watch her do it every day, and I think if she can do that, I can do my job." He paused. "I'm not comparing your situation to mine. I'm just telling you why I understand showing up." The room was very quiet. "The job is yours," Clara said. "If you want it, I want it. You'll need to give notice at your current employer. I'll handle it by end of week. The first flight is in 12 days. A domestic run to Seattle for a board meeting. I'll have Daniel send you the full briefing package." She looked at him with those direct, measuring eyes. "I want to be clear about something before you start." "All right, I don't need to be handled," she said. "I don't need special treatment. I don't need anyone to pretend the wheelchair isn't there. And I don't need anyone to make it the most important thing in the room. What I need is a pilot who is excellent at his job and professional in his conduct. That's all. Can you do that?" Michael said. "Then we're done here." She reached for the tablet. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Dawson." He stood. He shook Daniel's hand. He walked to the door, and then he stopped and turned back, because there was one more thing, not a professional thing, not a strategic thing, just a true thing that was sitting there needing to be said. "Ms. Whitmore," she looked up, "for what it's with what you came back to do after that accident, the way you rebuilt this company, I read about it last night." He let the words sit flat, undecorated. "That's not something most people could do. I just wanted to say that." She didn't answer immediately. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't fully read, not quite emotion, not quite dismissal. Something in between. Like a door that had been closed for a long time, shifting slightly on its hinges without opening. "Good morning, Mr. Dawson," she said. He walked out. In the elevator going down, Daniel stood beside him and said nothing until the doors opened on the ground floor. Then he said, "That's the longest she's talked to anyone in an interview in 2 years." "Good conversation," Michael said. "She didn't tell any of the others the job was theirs." Michael looked at him. "Then I'll try not to make her regret it." He walked out through the garter into the mid-morning air. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and called his mother, who was watching Lily that day, and told her the job was his. He could hear Lily in the background asking if he got it, asking in that particular voice she used when she was trying to sound casual about something she very much cared about. He told her yes. She made a sound that was half cheer and half something else, relief. Maybe the particular relief of a 7-year-old who had learned too early that things could fall apart. He sat in the parking lot for another few minutes after he hung up. He thought about 9 men who had walked out of that building and decided one woman's story was more than they wanted to deal with. He thought about a woman who had climbed back from the bottom of something terrible and turned it into a company that other people depended on and built their lives around. He thought about his daughter's lunch in the refrigerator and the little airplane drawn on the note. Then he started the truck and drove home. The job was his. The real work hadn't started yet. The 12 days before the first flight were the most information-dense 12 days of Michael's professional life. Daniel sent the briefing package, as promised, 74 pages of documentation covering the company's preferred aircraft, standard routes, fuel depot protocols, maintenance contractors, weather minimums for different aircraft types, emergency procedures, communication protocols, and the specific requirements of transporting a principal who used a powered wheelchair. The aircraft itself was a Cessna Citation CJ-4, a light business jet with the range and speed to handle most of Clara's domestic travel and a number of the shorter international routes. Michael had flown Citations before, though not this specific variant, and he spent 2 days going through the aircraft manual with the same concentrated attention he'd given to mission briefings in the military. Every system, every limitation, every failure mode, and the procedure attached to it. He also called 3 people. The first was a former military colleague who'd transitioned into corporate aviation and knew the world of executive transport from the inside. His name was Garrett, and he gave Michael 40 minutes on the phone that covered the unwritten rules of the job, the things no briefing document would tell you. How to handle changes to the departure time that came at 11 at night. How to manage the particular stress of a principal who was operating under extreme professional pressure and needed the aircraft to be the one thing that worked exactly as planned. How to read the difference between a problem that needed to be raised immediately and a problem that could wait for a better moment. The biggest thing, Garrett told him, is that your passenger's stress is not your emergency. Their schedule is not your weather minimum. The moment you start making flight decisions based on what your principal needs to happen instead of what the aircraft and conditions will allow, you've lost the thread. That's when people get hurt. Understood, Michael said. I mean it, man. These executives, especially the really driven ones, they live in a world where pushing through is always the answer. It works for them in business. It does not work at 30,000 feet. I know. You're going to have to hold that line sometimes. Even when it costs them something. I know. The second call was to his daughter's school to update his contact information and make sure his mother was listed as the secondary emergency contact during periods when he would be on standby. He had a conversation with Lily's second-grade teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Holt, who had been with Lily through all of the year since Emily died, and he explained the new job and what it would mean for his schedule. Mrs. Holt said, Lily talks about you a lot, Mr. Dawson. She's proud of you. He thanked her and held it together until he was off the phone. The third call was to his mechanic, who was in the process of keeping Michael's pickup truck alive through sheer force of professional will, and who needed to know that certain repairs could now actually be paid for. The night before the first flight, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and went through the route in his mind: departure, clearance, climb, cruise, descent, approach, landing. Weather briefing from 3 hours ago had shown clear conditions along the entire route with light winds at altitude. The aircraft was in the hangar, fueled, checked, and ready. Everything on the planning side was done. What he was actually lying awake about had nothing to do with the route. He was thinking about something Garrett had said near the end of the call. There's a reason 9 guys walked away. Some of it was what Daniel told you. Some of it might be something else. Just go in with your eyes open and figure out who she actually is before you decide what the job actually is. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about the interview. About the way Clara had looked at him when he said she'd come back to something everyone expected her to walk away from. The door that shifted without opening. He thought about what it cost to rebuild something yourself. A business, a life when the wreckage was visible to everyone watching. When every person who looked at you had already written the ending they expected. He knew something about that, not the same thing, not at the same scale, but the shape of it. The morning after Emily's funeral, he'd made Lily's breakfast and packed her bag for school and walked her to the end of the block to catch the bus. And she'd turned at the corner and waved at him with that small, serious face. And he'd waved back and held it together until the bus was out of sight, and then he'd walked back to the house and sat down on the porch steps and didn't get up for 20 minutes. But he'd gotten up. You always get up, because what's the alternative? He heard Lily turn over in her room through the wall. A small sound, the particular rustling of a child adjusting in sleep. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow was the first flight. He'd go in, fly the plane, do the job, that was all. He was asleep before midnight. The limousine arrived at the private aviation terminal at 7:45 in the morning. Michael was already there. He'd been there since 6, completing the pre-flight walk-around, reviewing the latest weather update, coordinating with the ground crew on the wheelchair lift and the interior configuration. He'd spoken with the maintenance tech twice. He had the airport's ATIS information memorized and was tracking one developing cloud formation to the northwest that would not affect the route, but that he wanted to keep an eye on anyway, because that was the kind of height he was. When the limousine stopped and the door opened, he watched the ground crew deploy the lift with practiced efficiency. Clara transferred from the vehicle to the aircraft lift and then to her position inside the cabin with the calm competence of someone who had been managing this logistics problem for years and had long since stopped allowing it to disrupt her composure. She was wearing a dark jacket and had a leather portfolio on her lap. She was on the phone. She did not acknowledge him when she came aboard. He did not take it personally. He closed the cabin door, walked forward, settled into the left seat, and began his final checks. When he was ready, he keyed the intercom. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore. This is Captain Dawson. We're cleared for departure. Flight time to Seattle is approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. Current conditions are excellent. I expect a smooth trip." There was a brief pause. "Good morning," she said. Flat, professional. She was still on the phone. He released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. The takeoff was smooth. The climb was smooth. He leveled at flight altitude and trimmed the aircraft and watched the horizon and thought about nothing except the job, the way he'd trained himself to think about nothing except the job when he was in the cockpit. 30 minutes into the flight, the intercom clicked. "Mr. Dawson." "Yes, Ms. Whitmore. There's turbulence forecast along the northern routing?" He'd checked. "Light chop possible between waypoints Bravo and Delta. It won't be significant. I can file an updated routing to take us south of it, if you have a strong preference for smooth air. Does the southern routing add time? Approximately 9 minutes. Then stay the course." A pause. "What's your assessment of the chop level?" "Low. I'd rate it at a level 2 on a scale of 10. "You'd feel it. Nobody would be concerned. Acceptable," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The intercom clicked off. He flew the northern routing. The light chop came in as predicted, a gentle, irregular movement, well within comfort parameters, the kind of turbulence that seasoned travelers barely register. He kept his eye on it, and it stayed exactly where the forecast said it would. When they were clear of it, the intercom clicked again. "Your assessment was accurate," Clara said. "It usually is," he said. Another pause, and then something he hadn't heard in the interview. Something quieter. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." He landed in Seattle 14 minutes ahead of schedule. Standing by the aircraft after the ground crew had taken over, watching the limousine disappear towards the terminal, he thought about what Garrett had told him about learning who the principal actually was. He was starting to understand she wasn't difficult. She was careful. After everything she'd been through, careful made complete sense. He walked back to the aircraft to begin the post-flight checklist, and for the first time in a very long time he felt something that wasn't quite happiness, but was in the same neighborhood. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Daniel Brooks stood in the empty conference room for a long time after everyone else had gone. The water glasses were still rattled slightly out of place from where Michael had hit the table. He hadn't moved them. He stood there, looking at the contract folder that Michael had picked up and signed right there, standing up, without sitting back down. Without asking for a pen, he'd pulled one from his jacket pocket, like he'd carried it in specifically for that purpose. Gerald Voss had left without another word. just stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out with the careful dignity of a man who believed he was making the principled choice. Daniel had watched him go and felt something cold settle in his stomach. 9 men, and now the 10th had signed. He gathered the papers from the table and took the elevator up to the 14th floor. Clara was at her desk when he came in. She didn't look up immediately. She was finishing something on the tablet, the way she always finished what she was doing before she gave a room her attention. It used to make junior staff nervous. Daniel had learned to read it as a form of respect. She was clearing space for the conversation, rather than pretending to give it half her focus while actually giving it none. She set the tablet down and looked at him. He signed, Daniel said. Clara looked at the folder in his hand. Something passed through her expression, not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. What happened in the room? Daniel told her all of it, Gerald Voss's exact words. The way Michael had gone still before he spoke, the 4 words he'd said when he stood up. Clara was quiet through the whole account. When he finished, she was looking at a point somewhere past his shoulder, thinking. He defended me, she said finally. He didn't frame it that way. He just told Voss to get out and picked up the contract. That's what defending someone looks like when they're not performing it, she said. Then she looked back at Daniel directly. Don't tell me anything else about his personal situation. I already know more than I should from the interview. I don't want to factor it in. Factor it in how? Sympathy is a bad reason to trust someone with your life at 30,000 feet. She picked up the tablet again. His record will tell me what I need to know. Daniel nodded and turned to leave. Daniel, he stopped. Make sure the aircraft is ready 3 days ahead of schedule. I want him to have time with it before we fly. I'll call maintenance now. Thank you. He walked out and pulled the door closed behind him. He stood in the hallway for a moment and realized his hands had stopped being cold, somewhere in the middle of that conversation. For the first time in 8 months, he thought the job might actually work. He just wasn't sure yet what working would cost both of them. Michael spent those 3 days learning the citation, the way he'd learned every aircraft that ever mattered, not from a distance, not from manuals alone, but from the inside out. He was at the hangar by 6 every morning. He ran the systems in sequence, talked through procedures with the lead maintenance tech, a 30-year veteran named Roy, who had the unhurried precision of someone who had seen enough close calls to have a permanent and non-negotiable relationship with doing things correctly. Roy handed him a discrepancy log on the second morning and said, "Left fuel flow sensor reads a little high in the warm-up cycle. Not out of tolerance, but I wanted you to see the pattern." Michael studied the numbers. How long has it been doing this? 3 weeks. Previous pilot flagged it. Maintenance looked at it, signed it off as within limits. What does your gut say? Roy looked at him for a moment. My gut says keep an eye on it. Then we replace it before the first flight. Roy's eyebrows went up. It's within limits, I know. Replace it anyway. Roy studied him for another second. Then he nodded and went to put in the parts order. It was the moment, though neither of them said so, when Roy decided Michael Dawson was going to be someone he could work with. On the third afternoon, Michael sat in the left seat with the engines cold and the sun going down outside the hangar and just existed in the aircraft. This was something he'd done since his earliest flight training. Something no instructor had taught him. You had to know the feel of a machine before you trusted it with anything that mattered. You had to let the geometry of the cockpit settle into your body. Let your hands find the positions that would become automatic in the moments when thinking was too slow. He thought about Clara Whitmore while he sat there. He thought about what Daniel had told him, 9 pilots, different reasons, same result. He thought about Gerald Voss's face when he'd said what he said. The comfort in it, the absolute certainty that what he was saying was obvious, that no reasonable person could disagree. Michael had met men like that in the military. Not many, but enough to recognize the type. The ones who organized the world into categories and then got personally offended when reality declined to cooperate. He didn't hate Gerald Voss. He didn't have the energy for it. What he felt was something quieter and more durable. A particular kind of determination that came from being raised by a man who drove a delivery truck for 30 years and came home every night and never once suggested that the size of the work was a reflection of the size of the person doing it. You did the job, you did it right, everything else was commentary. He set his hands on the yoke and looked at the dark instruments and thought, just fly the plane. The rest will work itself out. He didn't know yet how wrong he was about the rest working itself out. But he knew he was right about the flying. The first 3 months of the job settled into a rhythm that Michael organized around 2 fixed points, Lily at one end, the aircraft at the other, and everything else arranged in the space between. His mother, Ruth, had moved into the guest room for the periods when the schedule required him to be on standby overnight. She was a small, efficient woman who cooked more food than any household of 3 could reasonably consume, and expressed love through a complete refusal to acknowledge that anything was difficult. When Michael had explained the job and the hours, she'd listened and then said, "Lily and I will be fine. Go do the thing you're good at." Lily had her own adjustment to make. She was 7, which meant she understood enough to ask the right questions, and not quite enough to be satisfied by all the answers. One evening in the first month, she was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, while Michael packed his bag for an early departure, and she looked up and said, "Daddy, is the lady you fly for nice?" "She's professional," he said. Lily considered this. "That's what you say about people at school when you don't want to say they're not nice." He stopped packing and looked at her. "She's serious," he said. "She works very hard and she's very smart. I think she might be nice." "I haven't seen it yet. Maybe she's just nervous," Lily said, and went back to her homework. He stood there for a moment with his bag half packed, thinking about a 7-year-old's casual ability to see to the center of a thing. Maybe she's just nervous. In the cockpit, Clara Whitmore was exactly what she'd promised to be: demanding, precise, and professional without performance. She asked for accurate information and responded to it accurately. She didn't demand the impossible, but she also had a threshold for imprecision that was approximately 0. And in those first months, Michael learned the specific texture of her expectations, the way you learn a complicated instrument by playing it wrong a few times in low-stakes moments, so you know how it fails before the stakes are high. The first correction came in the second week. He'd given her a fuel stop estimate based on standard conditions, and she'd questioned it. He'd been 60% confident in the number, and 100% confident in his tone. And the mismatch had been immediately apparent to a woman who had built a technology company by understanding the difference between what people knew and what they sounded like they knew. "Mr. Dawson," she said over the intercom, "is that estimate confirmed or projected?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "Projected, ma'am. Based on current winds aloft. I'll have a confirmed number in approximately 20 minutes when we have better data. Then give me the confirmed number in 20 minutes. Don't give me projections as if they're confirmations." Understood. He gave her the confirmed number in 18 minutes. She didn't comment on the 2-minute improvement. She absorbed the number and moved on. He never gave her a projection as a confirmation again. The second correction came in the 5th week, and it was more complicated. They were inbound to Denver for a board meeting. The weather at destination had deteriorated faster than forecast. Nothing dangerous, but the ceiling had dropped to minimums that would make the approach workable but not comfortable. He had 3 options: continue, divert to Colorado Springs, or hold and wait for the front to clear. He'd made his assessment and keyed the intercom to tell her they were continuing. She listened and then said, "Walk me through the decision." Not, "What's the decision? Walk me through it." He did. He laid out all 3 options, the reasoning for each, and his recommendation. When he finished, she said, "What's the risk of the third option if the front doesn't clear in the window you're projecting?" "We'd need to divert anyway with less fuel margin, which makes option 2 the more conservative backup." "Yes, then your decision tree should present it that way." He absorbed that. "You want me to structure the options differently?" "I want you to tell me the story of the decision, not just the conclusion. I can handle the complexity. What I can't work with is a conclusion that doesn't show its work." A pause. "I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm telling you what I need to make good decisions on my end." He thought about that for the rest of the approach. He landed in Denver with a 12-knot crosswind and a ceiling that made the approach demanding and came out clean on the other side of it. And by the time the wheels were down, he had restructured in his head what it meant to communicate with this particular passenger. She didn't want to be managed. She wanted to be included. That was a completely different thing. The shift in how he talked to her changed something. Small at first. He started giving her the fuller picture, not just the conclusion, but the branching logic that led to it. And she started responding differently. Less like a principal receiving a briefing, more like someone engaging with the problem alongside him. 3 months in, somewhere over eastern Kansas on a late afternoon, flight from a conference, she said something that had nothing to do with the flight. "How's your daughter?" He blinked. "She's well, thank you." "She's 7.5. She'll correct you if you round down." Something happened in Clara's voice, not quite a laugh. The threshold of one. "What's her name?" "Lily." A pause. "That's a serious name for someone who corrects rounding errors." "She's a serious person," Michael said. And then, because it was true and he was tired from a long day, and his guard was down by exactly the right amount, she's been serious since her mother died. Like she decided somebody in the house had to hold things together and elected herself. The intercom was quiet for a moment. "How old was she?" Clara asked. 5. She was 5 when Emily passed. Another silence. Longer this time. He watched the instruments and waited. "I'm sorry," Clara said. Not the reflexive sorry of social obligation. The kind that comes from someone who knows something about loss and is choosing to acknowledge it specifically, which is harder and means more. "Thank you," he said. They flew in silence for a while after that. But it was a different silence than the one they'd started with. Less careful, less armored. The real test came in month 4, and nobody planned it. It was a Tuesday. Lily's school called at 7:15 in the morning, 90 minutes before Michael was due to report for a flight to Boston. His mother was at a medical appointment. She'd scheduled 3 weeks earlier and couldn't be reached immediately. The after-school program had a staff illness. The backup contact, his neighbor Janet, was out of town. He stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and ran the math and came up completely empty. He called Daniel Brooks. "I have a childcare situation," he said. "I need to know how much flex there is on the departure." Daniel's voice went careful. "The Boston meeting is at 2. We need block out no later than 9. I can make 9 if I have coverage for Lily. I'll let me see what I can do on our end for coverage resources." "Put me through to Ms. Whitmore," Michael said. A pause. "Michael, please," another pause. Then hold music for 40 seconds. Then Clara's voice, clipped and direct. "What's the situation?" He told her, all of it fast without apology or excess. "Childcare gap, no available backup, 90-minute window." He ended with, "I'm telling you so, you have accurate information, not because I expect you to solve it. If you need to arrange a different pilot for today, tell me now, and I'll spend the next 20 minutes finding you someone qualified." Silence on the line. Then Clara said, "How old is Lily?" 7. "Does she get airsick?" He almost missed it. "What, does she get airsick, Mr. Dawson?" He understood. "No, she's flown with me before. She's a good passenger." "Then bring her flat, final, not a favor, a decision. I'll have Daniel arrange a car seat configuration in the cabin." We depart at 8:45. "Don't be late," she hung up. Michael stood in the kitchen for approximately 4 seconds. Then he went to wake up his daughter. Lily was in her pajamas and half asleep when he told her she was coming to work with him. She processed this information with the groggy seriousness of a child whose brain was still booting up, and then she said, "Do I have to wear the blue sweater?" "Yes, okay." She started getting up. "Then is the lady going to be there, the one you fly for?" "She'll be in the back. You don't need to bother her." Lily looked at him with her mother's expression, that particular look Emily had perfected, communicated a polite but firm disagreement with the last thing you'd said. "I won't bother her," Lily said. "I'll just talk to her." He didn't have time to explain why that distinction might not be as clear to Clara Whitmore as it was to a 7-year-old. He packed her backpack with a book and some crackers and her headphones, and they were in the car by 8:15. When they arrived at the terminal, Lily walked beside him with her backpack on, and her blue sweater and the quiet, attentive manner she developed for new situations, taking everything in without broadcasting that she was doing it. She looked at the aircraft with open appreciation, and when Roy, the maintenance tech, came over to say hello and asked if she wanted to see the nose gear, she looked at Michael for permission, and when he nodded, she went with Roy, with the solemn enthusiasm of someone receiving a professional courtesy they intended to take seriously. Clara arrived at 8:40. Michael was doing final checks in the cockpit and heard the lift engage. He finished the checklist item he was on, and then came back to the cabin to confirm the configuration was right. Clara was in her usual position, portfolio on her lap. Lily was sitting across the narrow aisle in one of the cabin seats, backpack at her feet, watching Clara with the unguarded assessment of a child who had not yet learned that looking directly at someone could be considered rude. Clara became aware of being studied. She looked at Lily. Lily said, "Hi, I'm Lily. My dad is the pilot. I'm not supposed to bother you." Clara held the look for a moment. Something in her expression shifted almost imperceptible. A tiny recalibration. "You're not bothering me." "Okay." Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out the book. "I brought something to read. I'm reading chapter books now. This one has 400 pages. What's it about?" Lily looked up. She had not expected a follow-up question. A girl who figures out her grandmother is actually a spy. Is she a good spy or a bad spy? Lily thought about it seriously. Both, depending on who's asking. Something happened to Clara Whitmore's face in that moment. Michael was standing at the forward cabin door, and he saw it. Not quite a smile. Something that had been locked up for a long time, moving toward the surface, without quite breaking through. "That's a good answer," Clara said. Michael went back to the cockpit and began the startup sequence. And he thought about what his daughter had said in the kitchen 3 months ago, doing homework while he packed his bag. Maybe she's just nervous. The flight to Boston was 2 hours and 22 minutes. For the first 40 minutes, Lily read her book with professional dedication. Then she looked up at Clara and said, without particular preamble, "Do your arms hurt from pushing the wheels?" Clara looked at her. "It's a powered chair. I don't push it." "Oh," Lily considered this. "My friend Caleb has a brother with a regular one. He said his arms got really strong. That does happen." "Does it hurt, like originally, when you had to start using it?" Michael would have stopped that question if he'd been in the cabin. He would have apologized and redirected, and Clara would have accepted the apology, and redirected would have meant a door closing that had been, for the length of a children's book conversation, slightly open. Instead, with no adult management happening, Clara answered. "Yes," she said. "It hurt. The accident hurt, and the recovery hurt, and the first time I had to ask someone to help me with something I used to do by myself. That hurt in a different way." Lily nodded with the gravity of someone taking testimony. "My mom dying hurt like that too, the second kind." Clara was very still. "The kind where it's not like your body," Lily continued, looking back at her book. "Just everything else." The cabin was quiet. Then Clara said, in a voice that was different from any voice Michael had heard from her, across 4 months of professional interaction, "Yes." Exactly like that. Lily turned a page. "I like talking to you," she said simply. "You don't talk to me like I'm little." Clara looked at the top of the child's head for a long moment. "You're not little," she said finally. "You just haven't been at it as long as I have." Lily looked up and grinned. It was Emily's grin. Michael knew it without being in the cabin to see it, knew it from the sound it produced in the quality of the silence that followed, the particular warmth that entered a room when Lily decided she liked you. She decided she liked Clara Whitmore. Michael leveled at cruise altitude and trimmed the aircraft and stared at the horizon. He didn't know what was happening in the cabin behind him. He knew that his daughter had a gift, Emily's gift, passed down with everything else, for reaching people that other people had stopped trying to reach. And he knew that Clara Whitmore, for all her precision and her armor, and her absolute refusal to be defined by the thing that had happened to her, was still a person who had been carrying something alone for a very long time. He didn't think about what that meant for the job. He just flew the plane. When they landed in Boston and the ground crew took over, and Lily came up to the cockpit door with her backpack on and her book tucked under her arm, she looked at the instrument panel with the particular reverence she reserved for things she found genuinely impressive. "Did it go okay?" Michael asked. "The flight or the talking?" Lily thought about it. Ms. Whitmore cried a little bit. After I went back to my book, I wasn't supposed to see. Michael looked at his daughter. What did you say to her? Nothing after that. I just let her be. Lily adjusted the book under her arm with the practical compassion of someone who understood instinctively that some moments didn't need witnesses. She needed to just be sad for a minute, so I read my chapter. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Lily, he said. Yeah, you did good. She shrugged with the modesty of someone accepting a reasonable assessment rather than a compliment. She's not scary, she said. She's just been alone too long. He had no answer for that. He didn't need one. The limousine came and Clara transferred to it with her usual efficient calm, the portfolio on her lap, the phone in her hand. She had a board meeting in 90 minutes and a contract review at 4, and she was already somewhere inside the next 12 hours of her professional life. But before the car door closed, she looked back at the aircraft. Not at Michael, not at the terminal, at Lily, standing near the wing with her backpack on, watching the tarmac with wide and interested eyes. Clara looked at the child for a moment. Then she said something to the driver, and the door closed and the car moved. Michael would find out later from Daniel, who found out from the driver that she'd said, "Make sure they have what they need before they leave." 4 words that cost her nothing and meant everything. He didn't say anything to Lily about it in the car on the way back to the general aviation terminal. He just drove and listened to her describe the 400 pages she was going to finish by the weekend, and thought about a woman crying quietly in the back of an aircraft while a 7-year-old, with perfect instinct, simply turned a page and let her. Some things couldn't be arranged or planned or managed. Some things just arrived when 2 people happened to be in the same small space at the right moment. The job had started as a contract. He could feel it becoming something else, though he couldn't yet name what. He wasn't sure he needed to. He just needed to keep showing up. That was the thing he was learning about this job. About this woman. About the long, slow work of trust between 2 people who had both learned, the hard way, that trust was something you built in the small moments before you needed it in the large ones. He pulled into the parking lot at the general aviation terminal and turned off the engine. Lily looked at him from the passenger seat. Daddy. Yeah, baby, she's going to be okay, Lily said. Miss Whitmore, I just think she needed someone to talk to who wasn't trying to get anything. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, carrying more than she should have to carry. And still, somehow, with enough left over to give. Yeah, he said, I think you're right. He got out of the car. Lily jumped out on her side and grabbed his hand as they walked toward the terminal. Her hand was small and warm and certain in his, and he held it the way you hold something you understand completely and are grateful for every single day. The Boston meeting went well. He heard from Daniel that evening. He already knew it would. The Boston meeting closed a $14 million licensing deal. Daniel texted Michael the news at 9:47 that evening with 3 words, "She crushed it." Michael read the text standing in his kitchen while Lily's leftover dinner sat on the counter going cold because he'd forgotten to put it away. He set the phone down and finished cleaning up and didn't let himself think too hard about what he felt. Pride was the wrong word. It wasn't his deal to be proud of. It was something closer to satisfaction, the clean, specific kind that comes from doing your job correctly and watching what it makes possible for someone else. He put Lily's plate in the refrigerator and went to bed. The next morning he was at the hangar by 6. Roy was already there, which meant Roy had been there since 5, which was Roy's way of communicating that he took the previous day's flight personally in the best possible sense. He handed Michael a coffee and a printed inspection report without preamble and said, "Left fuel flow sensor is reading perfect." "Good call on the replacement. Your gut said so first," Michael said. "My gut doesn't sign the work orders." They stood there for a moment in the particular companionable silence of 2 men who communicate primarily through competence. Then Roy said, without looking up from the report, "Heard you brought your daughter yesterday." "Childcare gap. How'd that go?" Michael thought about Lily turning a page while Clara cried quietly 7 rows behind him. "Better than expected," he said. Roy nodded once, the way men nod when they understand more than was said and have the discipline not to say so. The second deal closed 3 weeks later, London this time. 8 hours across the Atlantic, a fuel stop in Reykjavik, and a contract negotiation that Clara had been building toward for 11 months. Michael had filed the flight plan, reviewed the weather for the crossing, coordinated with the UK handling agent, and run every checklist with the mechanical precision that the quality of the preparation was the only thing standing between a routine crossing and an emergency. Somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, with 4 hours behind them and 4 ahead, the intercom clicked. "Mr. Dawson, Ms. Whitmore, the Reykjavik stop. You said 45 minutes on the ground." "Yes, ma'am." "Fuel, crew rest requirement, and a weather update on the second leg." "Can we get it to 30? He ran the math. "If the weather update is clean and the fuel truck is staged." "I'll coordinate ahead. No guarantees, but I'll try for 32. "Try for 30. Yes, ma'am." He got them out in 31 minutes. When he keyed the intercom to give her the updated arrival time for London, she said good in a tone that, from Clara Whitmore, was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. He'd learned to read the scale. They landed at London Farnborough at 7:20 in the morning, local time. The ground crew was waiting. The car was waiting. Clara had a meeting at 9, and she would make it with 20 minutes to spare. As she transferred to the ground vehicle, she paused in a way she didn't usually pause, a fractional hesitation, not quite a stop, like a thought that arrived unexpectedly. "Get some sleep, Mr. Dawson," she said, not an instruction. "Not quite, something adjacent to concern." "Planning on it," he said. She nodded once, and the car moved. He stood on the tarmac in the gray London morning and thought, 5 months in, and that was the first time she'd said anything that wasn't operationally necessary. He went to the hotel Daniel had arranged and slept for 6 hours, and woke up thinking about it more than he should have. The thing about proximity he was learning was that it accumulated. Not dramatically, not in ways you could point to and say there, that's when it changed. Just a gradual building of specific knowledge about another person that you couldn't unknow once you had it. He knew that Clara worked best between 9 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, and that her second wind came around 8 at night. He knew she didn't eat on flights over 90 minutes unless the flight crossed a mealtime, and even then she ate efficiently and without ceremony. He knew the particular quality of silence that meant she was thinking through a problem versus the silence that meant she was simply done talking. He knew she read contracts the way he read weather charts completely, with the specific attention of someone looking for the thing that would cost you if you missed it. And he knew because you couldn't spend this many hours in close professional proximity to a person without knowing that she was lonelier than she let on. Not lonely in the way people meant when they used the word casually. Lonely in the structural sense, the way a building can be architecturally sound and still have no light in certain rooms. She had a board, she had staff, she had professional relationships that functioned with high efficiency. What she didn't have, as far as Michael could observe, was anyone who talked to her the way Lily had talked to her on that Boston flight. Without agenda, without the weight of what she represented or what she could do for them. He wasn't going to be the person who fixed that. It wasn't his job, and he was careful about his job. But he noticed it, and noticing it changed in small ways how he spoke to her. Not unprofessionally, not with presumption, just with the additional millimeter of human acknowledgement that says, "I see you in there." The London deal closed for $26 million over 2 days. Daniel called Michael while he was doing the pre-flight for the return crossing and said, "She's in a good mood. Just so you know." Michael didn't know what to do with that information operationally, so he filed it and said, "Copy that." I mean, she actually smiled at someone this morning. One of the junior associates. He nearly fell over. "Daniel, yeah, I'm doing a pre-flight, right. Sorry, she's ready when you are." He finished the pre-flight. The return crossing was smoother than the outbound. The weather over the Atlantic had settled into a cooperative high-pressure system that gave them clean air and favorable winds all the way to the eastern seaboard. Clara slept for 3 hours somewhere over the middle of the ocean, which she almost never did on flights. Michael noticed it on the cabin monitor and turned the intercom volume down to minimum and held his course without deviation. When she woke, she didn't say anything for 20 minutes. Then she clicked the intercom and said, "How long did I sleep?" Just over 3 hours. A pause. You adjusted the intercom. You needed the rest. Longer. I don't usually sleep on flights. I know, why not? He thought about how to answer that. Because you don't trust the aircraft the same way since the accident, he said. Flat, direct, no softening. The intercom was silent long enough that he wondered if he'd miscalculated. Then she said, "No, I don't. You slept today," he said. Another silence. Yes, he left it there. He didn't push it. He just watched the instruments and let the implications sit in the air between them, where it could mean whatever she needed it to mean. It meant something. He could feel it. He just didn't name it. They landed at Teterboro at 3:15 in the afternoon. When the ground crew opened the cabin door, Clara had the portfolio open and was already back in work mode, phone to her ear, left hand moving through a contract page. But as Michael came back from the cockpit to confirm the ground arrangements, she looked up from the phone for just a moment and made eye contact. Not a word, just a look. He nodded. She went back to the phone. He went to do the post-flight. Roy was waiting at the hangar with the maintenance log and a thermos of coffee. "Good crossing?" he asked. "Textbook," Michael said. "London deal went through? 26 million. Roy whistled low. "Not bad for a few hours of driving. A few hours of very precise driving." Roy handed him the coffee. "Your girl called the desk phone. Forgot her dad doesn't carry it in the air." Michael looked at him. "She's fine," Roy said immediately. "Just wanted to tell you something about a book." He called Lily from the hangar parking lot. She answered on the second ring with the breathless immediacy of someone who had been waiting by the phone but was committed to not admitting it. "She did both," Lily said without preamble. "Who did both?" "The grandmother. In the book, she was a good spy and a bad spy at the same time. The author explains it at the end, a pause for dramatic effect. It depends on who you're protecting." Michael leaned against the hood of the truck. "That's a good ending. I know. I thought you'd want to know since I said it on the airplane." Another pause. "Did Miss Whitmore like London?" "I think so. Is she still sad?" He thought about Clara sleeping for 3 hours over the Atlantic, while he held the plane steady and quiet. "I think she's working on it," he said. "Good," Lily said, with the brisk satisfaction of someone checking an item off a list. "Tell her I said hi. I'll pass it along, okay? Grandma made pot roast. Come home." He drove home. He passed along the message 3 days later, not because it was operationally necessary, but because it was true and because Clara Whitmore was, underneath everything, a person who deserved to know that a 7-year-old on the other side of a work schedule was thinking about her. He said it at the end of a departure briefing, after all the operational items were covered, as a single additional fact. "My daughter asked me to tell you she said hi." Clara looked at him. "She finished the book," he added. The grandmother was both. Something happened in Clara's expression that he'd never seen there before. Not the threshold of a smile, an actual one. Small, controlled, as if she was rationing it. But real. "Tell her I said hi back," Clara said he would. The month that followed was the hardest stretch of the job so far, and it had nothing to do with flying. Apex Horizon was in the middle of a public funding round, which meant Clara was working 18-hour days, and the travel schedule had expanded to a degree that required Michael to sit down with Daniel and build a new 2 standby protocol. There were weeks with 4 flights, 1 week with 6. The destinations ranged across the continental U.S. and twice to Europe, and the margins on some of the departures were tight enough that Michael instituted a personal rule about sleep minimums that he enforced with the same inflexibility he applied to fuel reserves. He almost had to fight for it once. It was a Wednesday. He'd landed from Chicago at 11:45 at night. The original schedule had a departure for Dallas at 9 the next morning, which gave him adequate rest. At 6:15, Daniel called. "Dallas moved up. She needs block out at 7:30. Michael did the math. "That's not enough rest, I know." "She has a breakfast meeting that—" "Daniel, that is not enough rest. I've had 6 hours and 45 minutes. FAA minimums exist for a reason. Can you make an exception just this? No flat. Final. I can give her a 7:30 blockout if she pushes the Dallas meeting by 90 minutes and I can get hour and a half. Otherwise, we go at 9 as scheduled. Those are the options." Silence on the line. "I'll call her," Daniel said. He called back in 4 minutes, 9 o'clock. She pushed the meeting. Michael exhaled. Thank you. She didn't argue, actually. She just said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell him I understand." He stood in his kitchen and looked at the coffee in his hand and thought about what it meant that she'd said that. Not fine, not okay, not accepted under protest, I understand. She understood because she'd seen the decision tree. Because he'd spent 5 months showing her what the decision tree looked like before he handed her the conclusion. And she'd learned to read it the way he'd learned to read hers. That was a different kind of trust than the professional kind. The professional kind was built on performance. This kind was built on knowing how someone thought. At 9 o'clock he flew her to Dallas. She worked through the entire flight, which was normal. When they landed, she had 40 minutes before the meeting, which was enough. She didn't reference the schedule change or the earlier call. But when she's transferring to the car, she said, "You were right this morning." He stopped. "Ma'am, about the rest requirement. You were right to hold the line." She looked at him directly. "I need you to always do that. That's my intention," he said. "I know." She looked at him for another moment. "That's why I'm saying it out loud." The car moved, and he stood there on the Dallas tarmac in the November cold, and thought that might be the most important thing she'd said to him in 6 months. 3 weeks later, everything changed. He found out about it the way you find out about most things that are going to affect your life significantly, not from the source, and not in a way that gave you time to prepare. He was in the hangar doing a systems check on a Thursday afternoon when Roy came in from the office with a look on his face that Michael associated with bad weather reports and worse. "You see the news this morning?" Roy said. "I was in pre-flight." Roy handed him a printed page. Michael read it. It was a financial news item, brief and written in the careful language of corporate journalism that signaled serious things without quite saying them. An unnamed source at Apex Horizons board had suggested that a review of executive leadership was being considered in light of risk management concerns related to Clara Whitmore's travel and operational pace. Risk management concerns. Michael read it twice. "When did this post?" he asked. "6 this morning." He handed the page back to Roy. "Has Daniel called?" "Not yet." He called Daniel. Daniel answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting for the call. "You saw it. I saw it. What's actually happening?" A pause that was a fraction too long. "There's a faction on the board. 3 members. They've been raising funds about the language. Is very careful, Mike. Very legal, about whether the current leadership structure represents the optimal risk profile for the company's growth trajectory. That's the language they're using, yes. What are they actually saying?" Another pause. "They're saying that a CEO who travels as extensively as Clara does, given her physical situation, represents an exposure to operational disruption that the company can't afford." Michael was quiet for a moment. "They're using her disability as a liability argument," he said. "They're using the travel schedule as a liability argument," Daniel said carefully. "The disability is implied. Who are the 3? I can't tell you that." "Can't or won't." A long pause both. He thanked Daniel and hung up. He stood in the hangar for a moment with his hand on the aircraft skin, feeling the cool metal under his palm, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. Something that sat between them and was sharper than either. He'd been in situations like this before, not corporate situations. Military ones. The kind where the people with the authority to make decisions had decided that someone under their authority was a liability, and had constructed the language to make it sound like policy rather than prejudice. He knew what that looked like from the inside. He also knew something the board members didn't. He'd spent 6 months in close professional proximity to Clara Whitmore. He'd watched her manage crises at 30,000 feet and in international contract rooms and in the specific relentless grind of running a company that existed because she'd built it from the ground up with her own hands. He'd watched her make decisions under pressure that most people would have frozen on. He'd watched her absorb setbacks and recalibrate without complaint, and come back to the next problem with the same clear, precise attention she'd brought to the previous one. Whatever they were calling a liability, it wasn't what he'd seen. What he'd seen was someone who survived something that should have ended her and chose not to let it. That wasn't a liability. That was the company's greatest asset, and they were too small to see it. He spent that evening thinking about whether it was his place to act. The job was to fly the plane. He'd said that to himself on day one and meant it. Don't insert yourself. Don't presume. The professional boundary was there for a reason. But Garrett had told him something else on that first call, months ago, in a conversation he'd mostly filed under background information and hadn't thought about since. Garrett had said, the moment you start making flight decisions based on what your principal needs to happen instead of what the aircraft and conditions will allow, you've lost the thread. He'd thought that was about weather and fuel and technical limits. He was starting to think it was about something bigger. The principal's safety wasn't only about the aircraft. He still hadn't decided what to do about it when the situation decided for him. It was a Friday morning. He arrived at the hangar at 6:15 to find a car already in the parking lot. Not a company car, a private vehicle, and sitting in it waiting was a man Michael didn't recognize. The man got out when Michael got out of his truck. Mid-50s, expensive coat, the particular posture of someone accustomed to having his arrival be an event. "Mr. Dawson," the man said, "not a question, that's me." "My name is Richard Hale." He extended a hand. Michael shook it without enthusiasm. "I'm on the board of Apex Horizon." Michael looked at him steadily. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hale?" Hale looked at the hangar for a moment, then back at Michael with the manner of a man organizing a speech he'd prepared. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please, there are concerns at the board level about the operational risk profile of Ms. Whitmore's current travel pace. I think you're aware of that." "I've seen the news." "Then you know the conversation is happening." Hale put his hands in his coat pockets. "I wanted to talk to you specifically because you're in a unique position. You observe Miss Whitmore's operational capacity at close range, on a regular basis, under conditions that are genuinely demanding. Your professional assessment of her fitness, let's say, her fitness for the travel requirements of the role carries weight." Michael was quiet. "What exactly are you asking me?" he said. "I'm asking whether, in your professional judgment, the current pace of travel represents a sustainable operational picture. From a flight safety standpoint? From any standpoint." Michael looked at him for a moment. The morning was cold. He could see his breath. Behind Hale, the hangar was dark, and inside it, Haynes sat in the quiet of a machine that had been maintained correctly and was ready to fly. "With respect, Mr. Hale," he said, "my professional judgment about my employer's capacity to do her job is not something I'm prepared to share with a third party." Hale's expression shifted. "I'm not a third party." "I'm a board member. You're not my employer," Michael said. "Ms. Whitmore is my employer. If she wants my assessment of anything related to her professional capacity, she can ask me directly. That's a very limited view of your responsibilities." "It's an accurate one." Hale looked at him for another moment. The calculated patience of a man deciding whether to change approaches. "You should know," he said, "that this conversation is going to happen with or without your input. The question is whether your perspective is part of it." "My perspective," Michael said, "is that the plane is maintained, the routes are safe, the pilot is rested, and my employer is exceptionally capable of running her company. That's my professional assessment. You're welcome to it." Hale held his gaze. "And if the board decides to restructure leadership, then I'll fly whoever's in the seat," Michael said. "That's my job." Hale nodded once slowly, the nod of a man filing information rather than accepting a position. He turned and went back to his car. Michael watched it back out of the lot and disappear. Then he turned and went into the hangar and stood in the dark with his hand on the aircraft and his heart running faster than he'd let it show. He knew three things. First, Richard Hale had come to him specifically, which meant they either needed his corroboration or they were testing whether he could be used. Second, Michael had just refused to be used, which meant Hale would report that back, which meant something would happen next that Michael couldn't predict. Third, he needed to tell Clara. He called Daniel first. "Richard Hale came to see me this morning." 3 seconds of absolute silence. "What did he say?" "He wanted my professional assessment of Clara's fitness for the travel demands of the role." Michael paused. "I declined to provide one." Daniel's voice went very careful. "How did he take that professionally?" "He filed it and left." "Mike," a pause. "You need to tell her. That's why I'm calling you." "I need to know the right way to do this. It's not an operational matter." It's a loyalty matter, Daniel said quietly. And you already know the right way. Just tell her. He told her that afternoon. He asked for 5 minutes at the end of the day, which was unusual enough that she looked at him with immediate sharp attention when he came in. He told her the whole thing, straight, no editorial, no interpretation layered on top, just the facts of the conversation in sequence. Who, when, where, what was said, what he said back. When he finished, she was very still. He came to you directly, she said. Yes, before talking to Daniel, before any formal process. Yes, she was quiet for a long moment. He watched her think. The particular quality of her thinking that he'd learned to recognize, not the fast visible processing of new information, but the slower, deeper kind that meant she was reassembling a picture she'd already had and seeing it more completely. They're building something, she said. That was my read. And you told him nothing. I told him you were capable, and the operations were sound. That's a matter of fact, not loyalty, she looked at him. That distinction matters to you. It matters in general, he said. I'm not in the habit of confusing the two. Another silence. She looked at the desk, at her hands, at something past his shoulder that wasn't in the room. Then she said, "Why did you tell me?" The question surprised him. Not the words, the tone. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't suspicious. It was something much more exposed than either of those. Like she was asking something she'd stopped expecting to have a real answer to. Because you needed to know, he said, and because I work for you. Not for them. She held his gaze for a moment that was longer than professional exchanges usually lasted. Then she nodded. Thank you, Michael, she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He registered it the way you register the moment. A weather system shifts not dramatically, not with fanfare, just a change in the pressure of the air around you that tells you something has moved. Is there anything you need from me? He asked. Not tonight. She picked up the phone. Go home. See your daughter. He went home. He made Lily's dinner and helped her with a math worksheet and listened to her describe an argument she'd had at school with a boy named Marcus, who had categorically incorrect opinions about which animal was the most dangerous. And he sat across the table from her in the ordinary kitchen light and let himself just be there, in that, with her. Later, after Lily was asleep, he sat on the porch in the cold and thought about the day. He thought about Richard Hale in the parking lot, about the careful language, and the expensive coat, and the calculation underneath both. He thought about Clara saying his name. He thought about Lily on that Boston flight, turning a page while someone cried. Knowing when to be present, and when to simply hold the space. He thought about how trust was built not in declarations, not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small, consistent choices. Telling the truth when a lie would have been easier. Holding the line when someone with authority asked you to move it. Showing up every day as exactly who you were. He didn't know what was coming from the board. He didn't know what Hale would do next. What he knew was that he'd been in situations where people with power tried to use proximity as leverage. And he knew that the only answer to that was to be exactly who you said you were and let that be enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was becoming someone he didn't recognize. And he had a daughter watching. That mattered more than any board. He went inside. He washed the dinner dishes and turned off the lights and went to bed. Tomorrow there was a flight to Phoenix. He would fly it clean and safe and exactly right. That was the job. That was always going to be the job. The Phoenix flight went exactly as it should have. Clean departure, smooth cruise, textbook landing. Clara had a product partnership meeting that ran long, and she came back to the aircraft 40 minutes past the scheduled return time without explanation. Which wasn't unusual during heavy work periods. Michael had learned to build buffer into his mental schedule, even when it wasn't in the official one. On the return leg, she worked without pause for the first hour. Then she set the portfolio down, which she almost never did mid-flight, and clicked the intercom. Tell me something, she said. What would you like to know? Hale, when he was talking to you, what was his tone? Michael thought about it. Measured. Like a man who'd rehearsed it but was flexible enough to adapt if the rehearsal didn't land. Did he seem surprised when you refused? No, I think he expected it. I think the visit was less about getting information and more about seeing how I'd respond. A pause. Testing your loyalty. Testing whether I could be separated from it, Michael said. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. What's the difference? Testing loyalty assumes it exists and tries to break it. What Hale was doing was checking whether it existed at all. He wasn't sure. Another pause. Longer. He could hear her thinking through it. They didn't think you'd stay with me, she said. I think they assumed that the job being hard was the same as the job not being worth doing. He paused. They were wrong about that. The intercom went quiet. Not the careful quiet of someone closing a door. The different kind. The kind that meant something had settled. He flew the remaining 40 minutes in that quiet, and landed in the dark at Teterboro, and drove home, thinking about the word Hale had used. Fitness. Whether Clara Whitmore was fit for the demands of the role. He'd been turning it over for 3 days now. Not because he had any doubt about the answer. Because he was trying to understand the depth of the dishonesty required to frame it as a legitimate question. He'd seen men in the military make the same move. Take a thing that was true, that the job was demanding, that the conditions were hard, and use it to obscure the thing that was actually being said. Which was that someone they'd already decided didn't belong was being handed a formal-sounding reason to leave. It was cowardice dressed as governance. He knew it when he saw it. The question was what Clara was going to do about it. He found out 11 days later, on a Monday morning, when Daniel called at 7:30 with a voice that was working hard to stay even. She called a board meeting, Daniel said, full board. This Thursday. Did she say why? She said she wanted to address the leadership review directly. A pause. Mike. The three who've been pushing this, they've been gathering material. Financial projections, travel logs, medical consultation records. Things that aren't supposed to be accessible without her consent. Michael went still. They accessed her medical records? Not directly. Through a third-party consultant they brought in to assess operational risk. The consultant pulled what was publicly available from the accident litigation and combined it with internal travel data. Daniel's voice dropped. It's not illegal, but it's close, and it's designed to look like objective analysis. Who's the consultant? A firm called Meridian Risk Partners. They do this kind of work for activist investors. Usually when they want to replace leadership in companies that are underperforming. Apex Horizon isn't underperforming, no, Daniel said. It's not, which means this isn't about performance. Michael sat down at the kitchen table. Lily had left 20 minutes ago on the school bus, and the house had the particular silence of a space that had recently contained a child. He looked at her cereal bowl still in the dish rack where he'd set it to dry. What does she need from me, he said. She hasn't said. Daniel hesitated. But I think she's going to need to use the travel record. The actual record, every flight, every destination, every outcome, as evidence that the operational pace hasn't compromised anything. I can pull that, she knows. She hasn't asked because she won't ask you to do something she's not sure you're comfortable doing. Tell her I'm comfortable, Michael said. Tell her I'll have it ready by Wednesday morning. Daniel exhaled, slowly, the exhale of a man who had been holding tension in his chest for 11 days. Thank you, don't thank me. It's data, it's accurate, and it's documented, and it says what it says. He spent 2 evenings building the document. Not a narrative. Not an argument. Just facts, organized chronologically, with performance outcomes attached to each entry. Every flight, every destination, departure times, arrival times, weather conditions, any deviations and their causes, safety decisions made and why. The fuel stop in Reykjavik in 31 minutes. The Dallas 9 o'clock after he'd enforced the rest requirement. The transatlantic return when Clara slept for 3 hours and woke up sharp and clear and closed a $26 million 48 hours later. He cross-referenced it with the public outcomes deals closed, meetings kept, product launches executed on schedule. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. The data made the argument better than any editorial could. He sent it to Daniel at 6 Wednesday morning with a subject line that read, Operational Record. Complete, accurate.
Daniel replied 4 minutes later with 2 words, perfect.
Thank you. That same morning, something happened that Michael hadn't seen coming. Roy called him at 6:45 while he was still at his desk. Mike, Roy's voice was wrong, tight in a way Michael had never heard from him. What is it? I need you at the hangar. What happened? A pause. Just come. He drove faster than he should have. Roy was standing at the forward access panel of the citation when Michael walked in. He had a flashlight and a tablet with photographs on it, and the expression of a man who had been awake
Since at least 4 in the morning.
and was keeping himself calm through sheer force of professional will. Found it on the overnight check, Roy said. Left fuel system. The new sensor we replaced last month. Michael looked at the photographs Roy held up. Talk me through it. Sensor's fine. What's not fine is the wiring harness behind it. Somebody worked on it recently. Not me, not my team. Roy's jaw was tight. The work order log doesn't show any access, but the connector was disturbed. I can see it in the insulation marks. Michael looked at the photographs for a long moment. The connector, the insulation, the careful, deliberate evidence of someone who knew what they were doing and knew what disturbing that connector would cause. If we'd flown this morning, Michael said. In the air, everything looks normal for the first hour, Roy said. Maybe more. Then the sensor starts feeding incorrect data. You'd see warnings, but they'd be ambiguous. You might think it was another sensor read issue, like before. By the time you understood what you were actually looking at. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Michael stood very still and looked at the aircraft and felt something go cold and precise inside him. Not fear. The thing that came after fear when you didn't have the luxury of being afraid because there was something that needed to be done. You documented everything, he said. Every photograph. Time-stamped, chain of custody on the access log. Roy looked at him. Whoever did this knew the airplane, knew where to work, and how to make it look like nothing had been touched. Who had access to the hangar last night? That's what I was up since 4 figuring out. Roy handed him a printout. The security log shows one entry at 2:17 in the morning. Badge access. The badge number belongs to a maintenance contractor we've used 3 times in the last year. Subcontracted through a firm called, he checked the printout. Michael read it before he said it. Meridian Risk Partners had a facility management subsidiary. The same firm the board faction had hired as their risk consultant. Michael looked at Roy. Roy looked back at him. I'm calling the FAA, Roy said. Yes, Michael said, and I'm calling Daniel right now. Don't touch anything else. He stepped outside and called Daniel. The phone rang once. The aircraft was tampered with, Michael said. Silence, absolute. For 4 full seconds, say that again, Daniel said. Wiring harness on the left fuel system, accessed overnight by someone using a contractor badge. The contractor firm has a subsidiary connection to Meridian Risk Partners. Michael kept his voice flat and controlled. Roy found it on the overnight check.
If we'd flown the Thursday schedule.
Mike, Daniel's voice was barely audible. Clara is scheduled to fly Thursday morning. The board meeting is Thursday afternoon. The full shape of it landed. Not just a smear campaign, not just financial projections and medical records dressed up as objective risk analysis. Something worse. Something that required a flight to go wrong at exactly the right moment. An incident, an emergency diversion, or worse. Something that would validate retroactively every concern the board faction had placed on record. A constructed failure. She needs to know, Michael said. I know today, Daniel. Not Thursday, today. I'll call her now. I'll be at her office in 45 minutes. He drove. He drove the way he flew in bad conditions, completely focused, nothing extraneous. Every decision made from the information available, rather than from what he wished the information was. Clara was in her office when he arrived. Daniel was already there, standing against the wall the way he stood when things were serious. Clara was at her desk, and she looked like she had absorbed the initial shock and was already past it into the operational mode that was her natural response to anything that required her to act rather than react. Michael sat down. He didn't wait for an invitation. This was not a meeting for ceremony. He told her everything. The wiring harness, the access log, the badge, the subsidiary connection to Meridian. He told her what Roy had said about the failure mode. The ambiguous warnings, the timeline. He told her what Thursday morning's flight would have meant in that timeline. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. She was completely still in the way she got when she was processing something that required her full architecture. When he finished, she was quiet for 8 seconds. He counted. Then she said, they needed an incident. Yes, something they could point to in the board meeting that afternoon. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of someone who had decided not to spend energy on being afraid when that energy was needed elsewhere. A diversion, or worse, something that supported the narrative they'd already built. Yes, and instead they have a tampering investigation. And a documented chain of evidence, Michael said. Roy has everything. The FAA will have it within the hour. Clara looked at the desk, at her hands, then she looked up at Daniel. Get me the company's general counsel, right now. She looked back at Michael. Can you fly Thursday? He blinked. The aircraft is grounded pending the FAA inspection. I have access to a charter through a partner company. Different aircraft, different crew. She looked at him directly. But I want you in that left seat, he understood. She wasn't asking about the airplane. Yes, he said. I'll fly Thursday. She nodded. Once then let's go to work. The next 36 hours were the most operationally intense Michael had been through since active duty. The FAA investigation moved faster than he'd expected, which meant the tampering was obvious enough to the investigators that they didn't need extended analysis to confirm it. By Wednesday afternoon, the agency had issued a preliminary finding of deliberate interference with aircraft systems. The word deliberate had a legal weight that the Meridian subsidiary was immediately attempting to manage through their own attorneys. The managing didn't work because Roy had timestamps, because the badge access was undeniable, because the wiring work had been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had been careful enough to be thorough, but not careful enough to be invisible to a 30-year maintenance veteran doing his job at 4 a.m. Michael spent Wednesday morning re-qualifying on the charter aircraft, which was a slightly larger Cessna Citation variant than he usually flew. Same family, different configuration. He ran the differences checklist with the seriousness of someone who understood that a 36-hour turnaround on an unfamiliar type required him to work twice as hard to be at the same standard he held on any flight. The charter company's chief pilot watched him work for 2 hours and then said, "You fly like you're getting paid by the error you don't make." That's more or less the idea, Michael said. He slept Wednesday night with his phone on and his bag already packed. Lily had been quiet through the week in the way she got when she understood that something serious was happening around her, even if the details were above the altitude of what the adults were sharing. On Wednesday evening, she sat beside him on the couch while he reviewed the flight briefing on his tablet and said, without looking up from her book, "Is Ms. Whitmore okay?" "She will be," he said. Lily nodded. Kept reading. "You'll make sure?" He looked at his daughter. The particular gravity of her. The way she carried weight without complaining about the weight. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I'll make sure." Thursday morning came cold and clear. He was at the charter terminal at 5:45. The aircraft was fueled and pre-flight was complete before Clara's car arrived at 6:30. She came aboard with the portfolio and the phone and the particular forward-leaning posture of someone moving towards something rather than away from it. She didn't look like a woman who'd spent the last 36 hours navigating a sabotage investigation and preparing for a board confrontation. She looked like a CEO going to work. Michael ran through the departure briefing with her. Standard format, all operational items covered. When he finished, she said, "Conditions. Clear all the way. Smooth ride. We'll be on the ground 2 hours before the meeting." "Good." She looked at him, not at the clipboard, at him. "How are you?" The question caught him. She had never asked it before. Not directly, not in the way that meant the actual answer, and not the professional one. "Ready," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I." He went to the cockpit and started the engines and taxied out in the early morning dark, and thought about what it meant that two people, after 9 months of circling each other, in the careful way of two people who had both been burned by trust and were rebuilding their tolerance for it from the foundation up, had arrived at this moment. This was what it had been building toward, not the romance of it, not the drama of it, the actual substance. Two people who had decided separately and then together that the right thing was the right thing regardless of the cost. He advanced the throttles, and the aircraft lifted clean and smooth into the dark winter sky. For 40 minutes, the flight was exactly what it should have been. Then the co-pilot, a charter company first officer named Walsh, glanced at his instrument panel and said, "You seeing that?" Michael was already seeing it. Left engine fuel flow. The numbers were doing something they shouldn't be doing. Not dramatic, not alarming by itself, but wrong in a way that had a specific signature. He ran through the diagnosis fast, cross-checked with the fuel quantity, cross-checked with the engine performance data. His hands were completely steady on the controls, and mind was completely clear, and he was running the decision tree the way he'd run hundreds of them, not from anxiety, from training. Walsh said, "Possible sensor issue?" "Possible," Michael said. "But we're not betting on possible at this altitude, with this passenger." He pulled up the weather for the alternate. Clean. Then he keyed the intercom. "Miss Whitmore." She was on the phone. She came off it immediately. "Yes. I have an instrument indication that I'm not satisfied with. I want to be direct with you." He kept his voice level. "The data is ambiguous. It may be a sensor issue. It may be something more significant. I am not willing to continue to our destination until I know which one it is." A pause. "What are the options?" "Continue and accept the ambiguity. Divert to the nearest suitable airport and have the system checked. Or hold at altitude for 20 minutes while I gather more data." He paused. "My recommendation is the divert." Silence. He waited. He would hold this line the same way he'd held the rest requirement line, the same way he'd held the line with Richard Hale in the parking lot. Completely and without negotiation. Then Clara said, "How far is the divert?" 18 minutes. The board meeting is in 3 hours and 40 minutes. "I know. If we divert and it turns out to be a sensor, do we have time to get back on schedule?" "Tight," he said, "but possible. If it's not a sensor, the meeting doesn't happen either way." Another pause. "Divert," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He turned the aircraft. Walsh was already coordinating with ATC. Michael flew with the clean, efficient movements of someone who had accepted the decision completely and was now entirely focused on executing it correctly. He landed at the divert airport 14 minutes later. The ground crew met them on the ramp. The maintenance tech was there within 7 minutes. Michael stood outside the aircraft with Walsh and watched the inspection and kept his phone in his pocket and didn't look at the time. Clara came off the aircraft and sat in the car the ground crew had arranged and made phone calls. He could see her through the car window, working, adapting, rerouting the logistics of the morning with the same forward-moving energy she'd brought to every other problem he'd watched her face. She didn't come out to ask how long it would take. She trusted him to tell her when he knew. The maintenance tech found it in 22 minutes. A fuel system anomaly, not the wiring harness this time. Something subtler. A flow restrictor that had been partially obstructed in a way that would have caused aggressive, ambiguous warnings over a long flight rather than a clear emergency. The tech looked at Michael with an expression that said, "This isn't right." "Document it," Michael said. "Everything. Photos, measurements, part numbers." Already started. He walked to the car. Clara lowered the window. "It wasn't a sensor," he said. She looked at him. "It was deliberate," he said. "Different method than the first aircraft. Subtler. Designed to produce ambiguous warnings rather than a clear failure." He held her gaze. "They expected us to push through it." Clara was very still. "They thought I'd tell you we needed to divert," Michael said, "and they thought you'd say no. They thought the board meeting would make you override a safety call." He paused. "They didn't understand how you make decisions." "No," she said quietly. "They didn't. The documentation is being done now. I'll call Roy and he'll coordinate with the FAA on the connection to Tuesday's finding." "How long until we can get another aircraft?" He blinked. "You still want to make the meeting?" "The meeting is in 3 hours and 8 minutes, she said. "Find me an aircraft." He found her an aircraft. A local charter company had a King Air available. Not a jet, but faster than driving and appropriate for the distance. He was qualified on type. He called Daniel, who called the charter company, and while the new aircraft was being prepped, Michael coordinated the handoff documentation, confirmed the route, pulled the latest weather, and briefed Walsh on what was being passed to the FAA. Walsh looked at him while they talked and said, "This has been the most eventful charter I've flown in 4 years." "Yeah," Michael said. "Me too. Is she always like this?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "Usually she's busier." They boarded the King Air at 9:17. Michael taxied without delay and was airborne in 6 minutes. The aircraft was slower and less refined than the Citation, and he flew it with the same precise attention he gave everything, because the aircraft didn't determine the quality of the flying. The pilot did. Clara worked through the entire second flight. 45 minutes before the board meeting, she set the portfolio down and clicked the intercom. "Michael, yes, when this is over," she said. "I want to talk about your contract." He was quiet for a moment. "All right, not today." "When it's done." "Understood." A pause. "Then you held the line this morning." "That's my job. You held it when I had every reason to want you to move it." Her voice had something in it that he didn't hear from her often. "Something unguarded. I want you to know I understand what that cost." "It didn't cost anything," he said. "It was the right call." "I know, that's what I'm saying." A pause. "Thank you." He landed at their destination with 2 hours and 12 minutes before the board meeting started. Clara transferred to the waiting car. Before the door closed, she looked back at him one more time. "However this goes," she said. He looked at her. "However it goes," he said. "You're still the CEO tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment. Then the car moved and she was gone. He stood on the ramp in the cold air and watched it go. Walsh came up beside him. "She's something else," he said. "Yeah," Michael said. "You think she wins?" Michael thought about 9 months of accumulated knowledge. About a woman who had survived a crash that should have ended her and built a company on the other side of it. About the specific durable quality of her that he'd been watching from 3 feet away for 3/4 of a year. About what it meant to hold a line. "She already won," he said. "The meeting's just paperwork." He went to do the post-flight. His hands were steady. They'd always been steady. That was the job. That was always going to be the job. Walsh drove him to a small terminal building near the ramp while the King Air was being secured, and Michael sat in a plastic chair with a cup of bad coffee and his phone face up on his knee and waited. He was good at waiting. The military had built that into him, the way it built everything else, through repetition and necessity, through enough hours in enough holding patterns that waiting stopped feeling like passivity and started feeling like its own form of action. You waited correctly or you waited badly. Correct waiting meant being ready. It meant using the quiet to stay sharp rather than letting it erode you. He drank the coffee. He reviewed the King Air post-flight notes on his tablet. He called Roy, who had already been on the phone with the FAA for 2 hours, and said the second tampering finding had been formally connected to the first by the investigators, which meant the legal picture was no longer ambiguous. Meridian Risk Partners had engaged 4 attorneys by noon. Their client, the board faction, had gone quiet, in the way that people go quiet when they understand that the narrative has left their control. Roy's voice had something in it that Michael recognized as the particular satisfaction of a man who does careful work and has just watched that work matter at exactly the right moment. "The FAA investigator told me off the record," Roy said, "that whoever did the second modification was more sophisticated than the first. Different method, less obvious, but they made one mistake." "What mistake?" "They used the same torque pattern on the fasteners. Same hand, same tool, probably. The investigator matched it to photographs from Tuesday's finding." A pause. "It's the same person, Mike. One person accessed both aircraft." Michael absorbed that. "That's going to matter in court." "It's already mattering," Roy said. "The contractor who used the badge Tuesday night. He lawyered up this morning and then unlawyered 20 minutes later. I think he's talking." He thanked Roy and hung up. He looked at the ceiling of the small terminal and thought about the architecture of what had been built against Clara Whitmore. Not just the financial narrative and the medical records and the risk consultant's report. The aircraft, 2 aircraft, the plan behind the plan, built on the assumption that she would be pressured into ignoring a safety call, or that the pilot flying her would be pressured, or that the incident would happen before anyone was looking closely enough to see the hand behind it. They had underestimated her. They had also underestimated him. He didn't feel triumphant about that. He felt the clean, sober satisfaction of a man who had held to the simplest possible version of doing his job correctly and watched it be, in the end, exactly enough. His phone rang at 2:17 in the afternoon. "Daniel." He answered before the second ring finished. "Tell me." Daniel's voice came through with something underneath it that Michael had never heard there before. Something loose, unguarded. The voice of a man who had been holding himself very tightly for a very long time and had just been given permission to let go. She walked them through it, Daniel said. All of it. The operational record you compiled, the deal history, the revenue trajectory, the FAA findings, both of them. She put the Meridian connection on the screen in front of the full board, and she walked through it line by line without raising her voice once. A pause. Richard Hale tried to interrupt her twice. She just looked at him and kept going. What happened when she finished? The three who'd been pushing the review asked for a recess. Daniel made a sound that was almost a laugh. She said no. She said they'd had months to build their case, and she'd had 36 hours, and she thought the time allocation was already generous enough. A pause. Then she called for a vote of confidence. Michael's hand tightened on the phone. She won it 9-3, Daniel said. The three abstained rather than vote against her. Which tells you everything. Another pause.
It's over, Mike.
She won. He sat very still in the plastic chair. Where is she now? He said. Still in the boardroom. She asked everyone else to leave. I think she needed a minute alone. He understood that completely. Tell her I'll be at the aircraft whenever she's ready, he said. Already sent. He hung up and sat with the empty coffee cup in his hand, and felt the thing that had been wound tight inside him for 4 days slowly release. Not dramatically, not with any kind of ceremony, just a quiet unwinding like a cable under tension that has been given slack. He thought about Gerald Voss in the conference room 9 months ago, saying what he'd said, with the comfortable certainty of a man who'd decided the truth of a thing without looking at it. He thought about Richard Hale in the parking lot at 6 in the morning in his expensive coat, asking Michael to provide the corroboration they needed to construct a story about a woman who wasn't available to tell her own. He thought about 9 men who had all walked away from the same door. And he thought about a 7-year-old in a blue sweater on a flight to Boston, turning a page while someone cried, understanding instinctively that some moments don't need witnesses. Just space, and someone willing to stay in the room. He was still thinking about it when his phone showed a text from an unknown number. He opened it. It said, "Thank you for this morning." See, he looked at it for a long moment, the initial. The deliberate informality of it. The fact that she'd found his personal number, which he'd never given her directly, because she was Clara Whitmore and she was thorough about the things that mattered to her. He typed back, "Anytime. That's what I'm here for." He thought about sending it. Then he deleted the second sentence. He sent, "Anytime." Because that was truer. Not a job description. Not a professional boundary statement. Just the simple, complete fact of it, anytime. She was ready to leave at 4:30. She came out to the ramp with Daniel 2 steps behind her, and the portfolio under her arm, and the forward posture that meant she was already 3 problems past the one she'd just solved. But there was something different about the way she moved. Michael noticed it immediately and couldn't have articulated exactly what it was. Not lightness. Clara Whitmore didn't do lightness. But something structural had shifted. Like a load she'd been carrying at an angle had been redistributed. Like something she'd been braced against wasn't pushing anymore. She came up the King Air steps and settled into the cabin and looked at him where he stood at the cockpit door. "Good day," he said. "Productive," she said. And then with the smallest deliberate adjustment of her expression, "Yes." "Good day." He went to the cockpit. The return flight was smooth. Winds aloft had dropped, and the King Air tracked clean and level all the way back. Walsh sat the right seat and said almost nothing, because Walsh had good instincts about when silence was the right, professional contribution. 40 minutes out, the intercom clicked, "Michael." "Miss Whitmore, the contract conversation," I said when it was done. A pause. "It's done." He waited. "I want to make the arrangement permanent," she said. "Full-time, multi-year. I'll have the legal team draft it, but I wanted to say it directly first." Another pause. "The terms will reflect what the last 9 months have actually been. Not what was in the original agreement." I appreciate that. "I also want to add something that isn't standard in these arrangements." Her voice shifted slightly. The way it shifted when she was saying something that cost her something to say. "I want Lily on the approved passenger list, formally. As a named individual with standing access to the aircraft, a beat. She's part of the crew. She has been since Boston. I think the paperwork should reflect reality. He was quiet for a moment. She'll be very serious about that, he said. I'm counting on it. He adjusted the trim slightly and watched the horizon, and felt something happen in his chest that was too large and too complicated for a cockpit at 30,000 feet, and so he put it away for later. The way he put everything that was too large for the moment away carefully, with the intention of coming back to it. One more thing, Clara said. Yes, the board has formally referred the Meridian matter to the FBI. The contractor is cooperating. The 3 board members have retained criminal defense attorneys. She paused. I thought you should know that the thing you found in that hangar at 6 in the morning is going to have consequences proportional to what it actually was. Roy found it, Michael said. I just asked the right question. You've been asking the right questions since the day you walked into that interview. A pause. That's not nothing. He landed at Teterboro at 7:04 in the evening. Clara transferred to the car. She paused before the door closed, the way she had in London months ago when she'd told the driver to make sure they had what they needed. But this time, she didn't speak to the driver. She looked at Michael directly. Go home, she said. See your daughter. He drove home. He pulled into the driveway at 8:15. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, he could see his mother at the stove, and Lily at the table with homework spread out around her like a small academic weather system. He sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the window and felt the full weight of the day settle over him at once. The way weight waits until you're somewhere safe to arrive. He got out and went inside. Lily looked up when the door opened. She had a pencil in her hand, and her hair was coming out of its braid, which was always where it ended up by 8 at night, regardless of how it started the morning. She assessed him the way she assessed everything completely, efficiently, without drama. You look tired, she said. Long day. Did it go okay? He sat down in the chair across from her. It went okay. She studied him for another moment. Did Miss Whitmore win? He looked at his daughter, at the pencil in her hand and the homework and the unbraid and all of it. All the ordinary, irreplaceable, completely specific reality of her. She won, he said. Lily nodded once, matter of fact. Like she'd expected nothing less. Good, she said, and went back to her homework. His mother set a plate in front of him, without being asked, and squeezed his shoulder once, and went back to the stove, which was Ruth's version of a full emotional address. He ate. He helped Lily finish the last 2 problems on the homework sheet, which involved fractions and required more negotiation than the board meeting had. He read her a chapter of the new book she'd started, which was about a boy who discovered his grandfather had been a navigator on a ship that didn't officially exist. And he put her to bed and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark for a moment after she'd closed her eyes. Daddy, she said, not quite asleep. Yeah, baby. Is Miss Whitmore going to be okay now? For real? He thought about that. About a woman who had survived a crash and built a company and walked into a boardroom with 36 hours of preparation against months of coordinated opposition and won 9-3 without raising her voice. For real, he said. A pause. I liked flying with her. She liked flying with you. A longer pause. The kind that meant she was almost under. She needs more people who don't want anything, Lily said, from somewhere very close to sleep. He stayed on the edge of the mattress until her breathing changed. Then he got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table with a glass of water and his phone and the quiet of the house around him. He thought about what came next, the permanent contract, the multi-year arrangement, Lily on the passenger list, the board faction in the hands of federal investigators, the Meridian subsidiary whose attorneys were going to spend the next year trying to construct a version of reality that didn't end in criminal charges. He thought about the operational record he'd compiled over 2 evenings. Every flight, every decision, every outcome. The specific accumulation of 9 months of showing up and doing the work correctly, which had turned out to be, in the end, the only evidence that mattered. He thought about Gerald Voss in the conference room, saying the quiet part at full volume and the absolute certainty in his face. The certainty that what he was saying was so obvious that no reasonable person could disagree. He thought about what it cost Clara Whitmore every single day to walk into rooms full of people who had already decided what she was and what she couldn't do, and to do the work anyway, cleanly and completely, without requiring those people to be better than they were, in order to keep going. That was strength, not the performed kind, the structural kind. The kind that holds without asking to be recognized for holding. He'd been in proximity to it for 9 months, and he understood it differently now than he had in the beginning. In the beginning, he'd seen resilience. Now he saw something more specific. He saw a person who had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and refused to let it be the most important thing about her, and had done that refusing quietly, every day, without audience, without reward, because the alternative was letting the crash define the whole flight. He understood that from the inside. He'd been doing the same thing since the morning after Emily's funeral, when he'd walked Lily to the bus and stood on the porch, and then gotten up. You always got up. Because the people depending on you needed you vertical. And because somewhere underneath the grief and the weight of it, you still believed there was something worth being vertical for. He picked up his phone. He had 3 missed texts from Daniel, all variations of good news, and 1 voicemail from Roy that he'd listened to in the morning. He had a notification from Lily's school about a field trip permission slip he needed to sign. He had a weather update for tomorrow that showed clear conditions across the northeastern corridor. And he had 1 final text, sent at 8:52, that he'd missed while he was reading to Lily. It was from Clara. It said, "She's right, you know. About not wanting anything. It's rarer than people think." He read it twice. He didn't know how to respond to it in a way that was adequate, so he responded in the way he'd learned, worked best with Clara Whitmore directly, without decoration, with exactly as many words as were needed, and none that weren't. He typed, "She gets it from her mother, he sent it." Then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and thought about Emily. The particular way Emily had of walking into rooms where people were pretending and just quietly declining to pretend. Not aggressively, not as a statement, just the simple, complete refusal of a woman who'd decided long ago that the truth of people was more interesting than the performance of them. Lily had inherited it whole, and he had learned it by proximity. The way you learn most things that actually change you, not from instruction, but from spending enough time near someone who already knew. The phone showed a response from Clara. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." He smiled. In the dark kitchen, alone, the smile of a man who has arrived somewhere without knowing he was traveling. He typed, "She is. You'd like each other." Clara's response came in 20 seconds, which was fast for a woman who treated every form of communication as a deliberate act rather than a reflex. She wrote, "I already do." He set the phone down on the table. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that meant good flying conditions in the morning. He'd check the briefing before he slept. He'd call Roy about the voicemail. He'd sign the permission slip for the field trip and put it in Lily's bag so she'd find it in the morning and not have to remind him, which she would have done with the patient efficiency of someone who had learned that adults occasionally needed managing. He had a flight in 3 days, a new permanent contract being drafted by Clara's legal team. A daughter who had decided that the CEO of a billion-dollar company was approachable because she was 7 and had not yet learned to find power intimidating, which was possibly the most valuable thing Lily had ever accidentally done for anyone. He had a job that had started as survival and become something else entirely. Something he didn't have a clean word for and didn't need one. It was the job, and it was more than the job, and both of those things were true at the same time, which was how the best things in life usually worked. He washed his glass. He turned off the kitchen light. Before he went to bed, he stood in the hallway outside Lily's room and listened to her breathe in the dark. The specific rhythm of her, the sound that had anchored him every night for 18 months to the concrete fact of being needed and being present, and those 2 things being enough. He thought about the first morning after he'd been hired. Sitting in the parking lot of Apex Horizon, in the pickup truck, thinking about 9 men who'd walked away from a door, and 1 woman who kept showing up in spite of them. He hadn't known then what the job would become. He hadn't known that a 7-year-old with her mother's instincts would reach a guarded woman in a way that years of professional distance had not. He hadn't known that trust, rebuilt carefully and without ceremony in the accumulated small moments of 9 months, would end up being the only thing that stood between sabotage and catastrophe. He hadn't known that holding a simple line do the job correctly, Tell the truth. Protect the person you're responsible for. Refuse to be used would turn out to be both the hardest and the most straightforward thing he'd ever done. He went to bed. He slept without difficulty for the first time in 4 days. In the morning, Lily found the permission slip in her bag at breakfast and looked up at him, with the expression of someone whose faith in a system has been validated. "You remembered," she said. "I remembered." She went back to her cereal. Then, without looking up, "Can we have Miss Whitmore over for dinner sometime? I want to show her my new book." He poured his coffee. "I'll ask her. Tell her we have pot roast." A pause. "Grandma's pot roast, not yours, no offense, none taken." She ate her cereal. He drank his coffee. The morning light came through the window the way it always did, ordinary and specific and completely itself. Later, when a journalist writing a profile on Clara Whitmore asked Michael Dawson why he'd taken a job that 9 other pilots had refused, he thought about all the complicated true things he could say. About the money and the need and the resume and the 3-hour drive to an interview he almost didn't take. About Gerald Voss's face in the conference room. About a little girl asking if the lady was nice and deciding on her own that the answer was yes. He thought about a flight over the Atlantic in the dark, holding an aircraft steady and quiet, while someone who had been carrying everything alone for too long finally slept. He thought about a parking lot at 6 in the morning, and a man in an expensive coat who believed that proximity could be converted into leverage if you applied enough pressure to the right person. He thought about Roy at 4 in the morning with a flashlight and 30 years of experience and the particular durable integrity of a man who did his job completely, because the alternative was unacceptable. He thought about landing a King Air at a divert airport and watching a woman get into a car and make phone calls for 2 hours without once coming out to ask how long it would take, because she had decided to trust the person she'd put in the left seat. He thought about Lily on the edge of sleep, saying she needs more people who don't want anything. And he gave the journalist the shortest true version of all of it, which was also the most complete. "Everyone else saw a wheelchair," he said. "I saw a person who wasn't finished yet." The journalist asked if he thought the experience had changed him. He thought about that for a moment. "I think it reminded me," he said, "that the best thing you can do for someone is show up as exactly who you are and let that be enough. And the best thing you can do for yourself is find people worth showing up for." The journalist asked if he thought Clara Whitmore would agree with that characterization. He smiled. "You'd have to ask her," he said, "but I think she'd say it more efficiently." He was right. When the same journalist asked Clara that question, 2 weeks later, she looked at the recorder on the table between them and said 4 words. He didn't need convincing. Then she went back to work. That was the whole story, and it was enough. A single father who stepped into a cockpit that 10 men had avoided, and a woman who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone who would simply do the job without needing her to be less than she was. 2 people, broken in different ways, who found in each other not rescue but recognition. The quiet, durable recognition of one person who refuses to quit seeing another person who refuses to be defeated, and both of them understanding, without ever saying it plainly, that this is what it looks like when strength finds its equal. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, just 2 people who showed up every day as exactly who they were, and that turned out to be everything.